There it is on Victoria Crater, looking possibly at its last sunset, or maybe at its first sunrise when the storm's clearing. I'll leave that up to the viewer. I know this is a Mars conference, but Saturn's a cool planet, and this spacecraft actually got me revitalised into space art again. This is Cassini undertaking its most hazardous part of the mission, actually going through the Cassini division of Saturn's ring and then having to enter Saturn's orbit. The Cassini division is supposed to be clear, but it's not quite that clear, so there was a little bit of doubt as to whether the spacecraft would survive. Thankfully it did. This is based on fairly recently when Cassini actually did a close flyby over Enceladus and actually flew through the geysers that occur near the southern region there. You notice that the Huygens spacecraft is no longer present. It's currently a permanent resident of Titan. Speaking of Titan, there's lakes in the North Pole, and I'm not 100% sure whether you can see Saturn from this altitude or not. I believe you can. Those lakes aren't made of water, they're made of liquid methane, and that rocky substance is actually ice. So it's almost as cold there as Canberra is at the moment in Australia when I left it. Finally, because it was a 40th anniversary recently, I couldn't help but throw in an Apollo image. I would like to think I will be doing artwork similar to this, not using Apollo hardware, not using the moon, but actually using Mars. And that concludes my brief. Thank you very much.
Now we move from two-dimensional art to the realm of film. George.
Michael has asked me to say a few words about some of the movies I've made, and I promise you I can relate them all to Mars. But first, since this is a meeting of explorers or would-be explorers, some essential information needs to be made clear. I know this because I was born on Columbus Day, 1943 in England. Columbus Day commemorates October 12, 1492, when Columbus landed in the Bahamas on Watlings Island and discovered the British West Indies. Well, the first film I made, and I'm the unlikely man who did it, was called Pumping Iron. And I made that movie because no one else would touch Arnold Schwarzenegger. He'd been living in Hollywood for 5 years, and no one wanted or had any interest whatsoever in making a film about him. It was a mind-bogglingly difficult trick to do it. I went to 3,000 people one by one and raised $290,000 and made the movie. In the course of making that movie, the most difficult trick I had was Morgan Stanley became interested in the project through John Mack, and he said, "George, I kind of like Schwarzenegger, but I don't see how anyone's ever going to pay a dime to see him in a movie." So I had no movie to show, so I went to the Whitney Museum in New York, and this kind of activity could be instructive for getting to Mars. And I convinced the Whitney Museum to consider bodybuilding as art and to conduct a panel with a team of world experts on how bodybuilding and Arnold related to art. The Whitney Museum thought I might get 500 people there, and I thought I might get 600. And the night of the screening, there was a ferocious blizzard in New York, and I thought my goose was cooked forever. Someone came up to me because I was on the second floor of the museum getting the chairs set up, said, "George, you better check the audience outside." There were 8,000 people banging on the doors of the museum to get in. Now, to give you an insight into Arnold Schwarzenegger, a couple of months after that, Candy Bergen was in a car with me, and she said, "George, Arnold's gone exactly as far as he is going to go. His career is over, he's done it all." And I said, "Candy, one day Arnold Schwarzenegger will be governor of California." Candy Bergen said to me, yeah, George, and Ronald Reagan might be president too." I went on from pumping iron, but it was a very difficult task, and it's not dissimilar from the one I hear the Mars Society time and time again faces in their eagerness to get to Mars. And the answer is to always keep trying. After that, I made Pumping Iron 2, which is an interesting film because it changed the way women approached athletics forever. As soon as they began lifting weights, they broke Olympic record after Olympic record, and it had a tremendous influence on women in sports. I made a movie after that about hunting and conservation in Africa, which is a subject that interests me because I believe that good hunting practices are the cornerstone of conservation in America. Then I got interested in Shackleton, 19. Very few people knew who he was in that era. And in the course of making 4 films on Shackleton, including an IMAX, I went down to the Weddell Sea in April 2000. And that's probably the most remote location shot of any movie ever made. The wonderful thing about it is that the ship's captain, who was Russian, found the edge of the sea ice, and I was trying to visualize how he was going to anchor in 12,000 feet of water. He instead ran the bow of the ship right up in the ice and parked his ship like a boat parked on a beach. And this was a 300-foot ship. And the image of that ship with the bow out of the water parked on the ice will remain with me for a long time to come. On the way back from the Weddell Sea, I talked on the radio, telephone, satellite phone to several editors in New York, and I ended up hiring Steve Squires, his brother Tim, which led to me being in the editing room while Tim was talking to his brother about the mission to Mars, the Mir mission. And at the end of the conversation, when Tim hung up, I said, "That sounds pretty interesting." He said, "Yeah, George, they've got IMAX quality cameras on those rovers that are going to Mars." And instantly, like a thunderbolt hitting me in the head, I thought, that is a film that should be my next film, because who would not want to see Mars on an IMAX screen? And that led to making Roving Mars. As to the question of art, since you've all seen Roving Mars, if you were here the other night, I'd like to set forward an interesting proposition, or at least I think it's interesting. I think that a lot of what NASA is doing in getting robots and rockets to Mars is building rockets and robots that are art simply by themselves as a form of sculpture or arts and crafts or design art. The first time I was allowed to get close to the rover, I remember just trying to reach out, almost as if I could touch it without touching it. And the NASA people let me get really close because they thought I was setting up a shot for the camera, when what in fact I was really doing was in awe, getting closer and closer to Spirit, who to me looked like a